All right, on to test 4, passage 1 of the ACT English portion. So let's go to it. Antarctic Adventure. This passage is about 2 women and how they climbed and skied across Antarctica. It was difficult from what the passage is saying, and while this is a great accomplishment, it's not really, that's pretty much all we need to know and before we move on to the question. So let's get to it. All right, number 1. It says, in February 2001, polar adventurers Liv Arnesen of Norway and Anne Bancroft of Minnesota became the first woman to climb and ski across the continent of Antarctica. All right, now what you'll notice is that they put this comma here, right there. And that's completely unnecessary comma because what you have is a compound subject. You have 2 subjects. You have Liv Arnesen and you have Anne Bancroft, okay? You don't separate them. That's one subject. It's a compound subject. That's like saying, grapes and soda are good. You just say grapes and soda. There's no comma that divides them. So that's the problem with that. So A would be wrong. B and C have that same comma problem where they have unnecessary commas. This one has that comma here and this one doesn't, but it has a comma after Arnesen. And you don't separate prepositional phrases like of Norway from what they modify with commas. You just leave it with no comma. So D is the only correct answer here. All right, on to question 2. And question 2 says the 2 former school teachers completed their 2,400-mile journey in 96 days. Completed is a perfectly fine word to use. It says they finished it by in this amount of time, and there really isn't any kind of problem here in the way they use this completed. I completed a journey. I completed a task. Achieved is a little different. It's not really used in this context. Achieved means more I accomplished this, I accomplished something. And you also wouldn't say I accomplished a journey, or I accomplished a trip, or I achieved a trip, or I achieved a journey. I mean, the way that's used is not proper in English. You could say you completed it though, which is fine. If you have finalized, finalized has more of a focus on I guess the design of something, if not the very end of something. So if you said, I finalized it in 96 days, it almost sounds like you finished the final part of the journey in 96 days. And that's certainly not what this is saying. And the way that they use 96 days, normally wouldn't use the amount of time in terms of the finalization. As in, you wouldn't say, I finalized it in 96 days. You could say the trip took 96 days, which is different. So finalized wouldn't work, and implemented also wouldn't work, because implemented means to do something, to put into place. And that is very different from someone having gone through something and then finished that task. Okay, so implementation doesn't really have to do necessarily with the completion of it or the finish of it, which this one, if you read the sentence, that's implied, that needs to be part of the meaning of the sentence. So the only correct answer would be no change, completed. All right, on to question 3. Question 3 says, on November 13th, 2000, the pair boarded a small plane in South Africa and took a 6-hour flight to Blue 1 runway, it is a solid ice airstrip on the Atlantic coast of Antarctica. All right, what you can notice immediately just from reading this is that it's really long. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it's a run-on sentence, but you'll see in the underlined portion, you have this comma separating. You have this comma separating runway with it is. Okay, so you have a new subject and a new verb, which follows a completely independent clause with its own subject and its own verb. So what you would need at the very least, it is some kind of semicolon here, or you need a comma in the word and, or you just need a complete separation with a period, and you don't get that, and so this is just a run-on sentence. created by this comma splice, meaning just a comma separating two independent clauses. So this answer choice is wrong. What about B? If you have B, you just have the comma and you eliminate the words "it is." So if you did that, it would just say, flight to Blue 1 runway, comma, a solid ice airstrip on the Atlantic coast of Antarctica. That works because whatever comes after this comma wouldn't be a complete sentence. It would just basically be an adjective phrase saying, what's that Blue 1 runway? Oh, a solid ice airstrip on the Atlantic coast of Antarctica. And it wouldn't be a misplaced modifier at all. The solid ice airstrip would directly modify what the Blue 1 runway is. You don't need any kind of conjunction there. You just have that comma because it's just a modifier that comes right after runway. So that works. What about runway without the comma? Well, you need to separate the modifier from whatever it modifies with a comma. So if you don't have that comma, it would just say 6-hour flight to Blue 1 runway, a solid ice airstrip on the Atlantic coast of Antarctica. You basically just have multiple nouns in a row, and so that would create a run-on part of a sentence. So that would be incorrect. And then D, runway. You would have, remember what I've said in previous passages where whenever you have the word being or you have the word having in an answer choice, you got to be very careful. Usually you can just say it without those words, or you can say it in a less wordy way, a more succinct way. And now you have being, so just be careful, watch out. It says, a 6-hour flight to Blue 1 runway, being a solid ice airstrip on the Atlantic coast of Antarctica. This is not technically wrong. The problem is, it's just that it's a completely unnecessary phrase. Being means to be, right? It's the present participle form of to be, so that's like saying ising, it is. Well, if you just say comma and then whatever it is, do you really need that extra word being? No, you don't really need it. It also just sounds very awkward. It's just an uncommon sort of non-idiomatic way of saying things. In English, you just kind of just say the comma and then you just say the modifier that follows. All right, number 4. Number 4, let's read it. It says, hiking unassisted up the 10,000 foot high Sijin Glacier, and each woman pulled a sled that weighed more than. Okay, this is a problem of a misplaced modifier. You have this word hiking unassisted, or this phrase hiking unassisted up the 10,000 foot high Sijin Glacier. Well, who's hiking? Is it the Anne that's hiking? No, it's each woman that's hiking, right? This is completely unnecessary. So what you really need to do is just get rid of that word, and then if the first noun that comes after the comma would be woman. So who would be hiking? The woman would be hiking. Each woman would be hiking. That's much more clear, where this modifier is directly modifying what it's supposed to. So grammatically it makes sense. Okay? So if you have F, obviously that doesn't work. What about when or while? Hiking unassisted up the 10,000 foot high Sijin Glacier when each woman pulled a sled that weighed more than 260 pounds. That's really unnecessary, and not just unnecessary, but actually it just makes a sentence no longer a full sentence. It makes it no longer an independent clause, because when you have this relative pronoun when or the relative pronoun while for answer choice H, those are not part of the subject or the verb at all anymore. So you would have a modifier here, and then you would have the when or while part of the sentence, and the rest of that sentence would be part of that when or while clause. Well, where is the subject and where's the verb? There is none. Okay? So that's the problem with G and H and F. So J is the only possible answer that makes sense. 5. If the writer were to delete sentence 5, the essay would primarily lose details that, all right, Where is sentence 5? Okay. So what does sentence 5 say? Sentence 5 says, the sleds carried all the women's supplies, including a tent, a one-burner camp stove, diaries, 2 sets of skis, a laptop computer, and a snow shovel. Wow, that's just a lot of detail about all the stuff that they had to lug along their trip. So what would you lose? Well, probably what that adds is a sense of, wow, these women had to carry all this stuff. They weren't just like moseying along and doing whatever they wanted. Reveal why Arneson and Bancroft were each limited to carrying about 260 pounds of supplies each. Was this about, oh, they had to limit it and that's why they could only carry these things? Well, that doesn't really make sense. This doesn't really talk about the limitations. It talks about all the stuff that they had to carry. What about B? Expand upon information provided in sentence 4 and also give readers a sense of what the women needed for their journey. Yeah, it says what they needed and it expands upon the prior information, how they had to carry around 260 pounds worth of stuff. What kinds of stuff? Was it like makeup and like gym clothes or something? No, it was diaries, 2 sets of skis, a laptop, snow shovel, a stove, a tent, a lot of stuff. It was very, very heavy. It kind of makes you appreciate, wow, these women had a lot they had to do. C, suggests that the women brought more supplies than they thought they would need for their journey. Is this about, oh, they brought too much stuff? It doesn't really seem like too much stuff. It's part of the 260 pounds of stuff. Is a tent unnecessary? Is a one-burner camp stove unnecessary? Are diaries unnecessary? No, they probably need to write some stuff down. Are skis or a laptop or a snow shovel unnecessary? No, it's not like they brought like beach balls and like soccer nets and it seems like pretty relevant stuff. So C doesn't work, and D, contradict the information provided in sentence 4 about the weight of Arneson and Bancroft supplies. No, all this stuff, a snow shovel and 2 sets of skis, all that stuff together, tent, that probably would weigh hundreds of pounds. It doesn't contradict the information about what they had to carry and how they had to lug it along. So the only answer choice that makes sense is B. All right, on to question 6. It says the best placement for the underlined phrase would be, well, what's the underlined phrase? Stretching for 1,000 miles. By December 1st, the adventurers had skied onto the polar plateau, stretching for 1,000 miles, a high frozen desert. Right away when you read this, you see stretching for 1,000 miles. Yeah, the polar plateau, I guess, could stretch for 1,000 miles. But then you have a high frozen desert. You have this noun following this description without the proper punctuation separating them, or a verb separating them, like stretching for 1,000 miles was a high frozen desert. And so this part here just doesn't make logical or grammatical sense, so this would be wrong. What about before the word by, revising the capitalization accordingly? So if I say stretching for 1,000 miles, comma, by December 1st, the adventurers had skied. Well, if you have stretching for 1,000 miles, a high frozen desert, is that describing the adventurers? Well, the adventurers don't stretch for 1,000 miles, okay? So that would be a misplaced modifier issue. What about after the word adventurers? By December 1st, the adventurers, comma, stretching for 1,000 miles, that's the same issue, where it's a misplaced modifier, it's not modifying what it's supposed to. Where stretching for 1,000 miles would be modifying the adventurers, but obviously the adventurers don't do that, right? And then if you look at J, after the word desert, ending the sentence with a period, if you have the adventurers had skied onto the polar plateau, comma, a high frozen desert, comma. So a high frozen desert is a modifying phrase, and a positive, modifying the polar plateau, and then comma, stretching for 1,000 miles. So stretching for 1,000 miles would be its own modifying phrase that follows desert that modifies desert. So you'd have a high frozen desert modifying polar plateau and stretching for 1,000 miles modifying desert. And there would be proper punctuation because you would have The polar plateau, comma, a high frozen desert. That's a modifying phrase. And then you'd have a desert stretching for 1,000 miles. You don't need a comma there because it's not just a simple appositive. It's not a situation where you have a noun modifying desert. You have desert that stretches for 1,000 miles. A desert stretching for 1,000 miles. So there's no comma needed between desert and stretching for 1,000 miles. And you have, in this case, you have all the modifiers properly modifying what they're supposed to. So it logically makes sense. You don't have modifiers modifying, you don't have desert modifiers modifying people, etc. All right. So the only answer choice that makes sense is J. All right, number 7. If we go to number 7, it says the first week, strong winds had blew daily. All right. This is, if you just read this, this is wrong that you should know. This is past, should be the past participle, or that they use here. The past participle of blow is not blew, it's blown. So if they use this past perfect tense, had blown, grammatically, that could work. But in this case, they just use the past tense and they couple that with the past perfect, and so this is incorrect. Okay, so the only way this could be correct is if they had used had blown. What about blew? You just change the whole thing to blew. That works because the whole sentence is in the past tense. So it's strong winds blew daily, yada yada yada. Everything works. There's consistency. What about blown? Again, blown fixes that blew issue, but if you use blown, that's not a verb by itself. That's just the past participle. You need to pair it with the word had blown. So the only answer choice that works is blew. All right, 8. Which of the following alternatives to the underlined portion would be least acceptable? All right. So let's see. The first week, strong winds had blew or blew daily, and the team sailed 210 miles in just 5 days. Okay, so is there anything wrong with that? No, this is the given, right? All the answer choices are what you need to replace it. The team is referring to the 2 women. Just if you want to be very quick about it, you could say the 2, Arneson and Bancroft, the women. All of these are basically direct synonyms for the team. But if you look at these, that's the only one that's different. Why would these be different? Because it says the first week, strong winds had blew daily. And if you say these, it almost seems like the winds were what sailed 210 miles. It's unclear. The antecedent for the pronoun, meaning what the pronoun these refers to, would grammatically indicate winds, even though logically you know it should be the 2 women. So the only answer choice that would not be acceptable, that's least acceptable, is J. And grammatically it's fine, but logically you know that there's a problem. Okay, so that's why J is wrong. Number 9. All right, number 9. This is another one of those what's the different one, as in what's the answer choice that looks different from all the others. Okay, if you say, for the next 5 days, accordingly, there was almost no wind and the pair sailed only 34 miles. So what happened on the prior 5 days? They had the wind at their back, and with the wind, they were able to go like 210 miles. That's far in 5 days. But for the next 5 days, they only went 34 miles. So the first 5 days, 210 miles. The next 5 days, 34 miles. Wow, that's a huge problem for them. And so why would it be accordingly? Accordingly means sort of, it has an intonation of as a result, but more or less the basic idea that you need to take away is that accordingly has to do with the same idea. There is a consistency. It's occurring along the same lines. And this is certainly not a situation where things are happening along the same lines. Things are very, very different. The first 5 days were very fast. The second 5 days were very slow. So you need some kind of contrast adverb there. Otherwise, wouldn't work. Because otherwise means if they don't do this, then this. And that's certainly not the case here. And what about consequently? Consequently means as a result. That's the same thing where you have the same problem of things are occurring along the same lines. What about however? However works. If you have a however that comes in the middle of the sentence, you need to separate it from the rest of the sentence with commas on both sides. So if you have for the next 5 days, however, there was almost no wind, and it certainly establishes that contrast, okay? The contrast is what you need to get rid of. C and A are very, very similar. B is sort of the closest word to a contrast besides the actual answer. It's just that you wouldn't use it in this context because it's not an if situation. It's actual factual things. Would this happen? And then, wow, a huge difference. By contrast, this next thing happened. All right, number 10. Number 10 says, on January 16th, Arneson and Bancroft reached the South Pole where they visited with scientists and replenished their food supply. Is there anything wrong with this? No. What's the subject here? Arneson and Bancroft, and then the verb is reached. Now you have this subordinating conjunction. In this case, it's a relative pronoun where. So this, all of this obviously is sort of its own little independent clause, but it's part of the main sentence. Okay, it's not an actual independent clause, but it has its own subject and verb. And here the subject is they, and the verb is visited with and replenished. So it's compound verb. You have two verbs, but they're sharing the same subject. They visited with, or to shorten, they visited, and then they replenished. So there really is no problem here that I can see. So F seems to work. What about G? Scientists and replenish. Okay, you wouldn't need the comma after and because there's no new subject. Okay, you wouldn't really have this comma there anyway. You would have, if you have this comma after scientists, you wouldn't. This and indicates that this is going to be a new independent clause. So you need a new subject, but there is no new subject, right? H is wrong because of the word there. This is supposed to be a possessive T-H-E-I-R. And if you notice, J has the same problem. It's about replenishing their food supply. Whose food supply? Their food supply. There denotes over there, like a location. And this is certainly not what is supposed to work. And if you look at G, well, you certainly wouldn't have this comma after and. If anything, you'd have it after scientist, but because there's no subject, this punctuation doesn't make sense at all. So the only thing that you have to do is just basically notice that the given sentence is perfectly fine. No unnecessary punctuation. It works fine. F is the answer. If we go to number 11, all right. 2 days later, they were again in bitter cold, and while climbing over a 10,200 foot high glacier named Titan Dome, and while climbing what? What? You have this phrase, and while climbing, that intonates, so while they're doing this, simultaneously, they were also doing something else. Because while means simultaneously at the same time. But this only says the first part. So this creates this dangling sort of relative pronoun or dangling sort of phrase that isn't completed. And so no change wouldn't work. What about 2 days later, they were again in bitter cold, comma, they climbed. If you say they climbed over a 10,200 foot high glacier, the problem is that you have a subject and a verb, they were, and then you have a new subject and a new verb, they climbed. Well, if you have that, you have two complete sentences. You have two independent clauses. And if you have that, you need to separate them with a semicolon, a comma, and a proper conjunction, like comma and, or you just separate them with a period and a new sentence. And all you would have if you plugged in B is comma, they climb. So there's no conjunction after the comma. So that would be a run-on sentence, okay? What about climbing? 2 days later, they were again in bitter cold, comma, climbing over a 10,200 foot glacier named Titan Dome. All right, they were again in bitter cold. They were climbing this thing. That works. Why were they cold? Because they were climbing. Who was climbing? They. So this modifying phrase, has no problems. It perfectly fits here. And that seems to work. It seems to be the only one that works. D, to climb. If you have 2 days later, they were again in bitter cold. To climb over a 10,200 foot high glacier named Titan Dome. Okay, if you have the word to climb here, to climb denotes some kind of purpose. They were doing this, do something, right? If I'm, I'm eating so that I'm not going to be hungry anymore, or I'm eating to get nutrients, the purpose of eating is to get that stuff. If you have to climb, it makes it sound like they were in bitter cold to do this. Let's go in the bitter cold so we can do this. That's not actually what this is saying. It's just saying that they were cold in the process of doing it. They were cold while they were climbing, okay? So that's why D would not work. So the only answer choice that makes sense is C, where it establishes that climbing is occurring as they were bitterly cold, and it doesn't set up that awkward and while climbing, where this intonates that there's something else going on, okay? You'd have climbing just directly going with that part, okay? So, in this case, C is the answer. 12. Let's go to 12. It says, fortunately, the wind was with them the final few miles, comma, and during those last miles of the trip, they were able to ski off the continent itself and onto the Ross ice shelf. This is maybe the first redundant error we've seen. Usually they come a little earlier. But if you notice, it says the final few miles, and then it says those last few miles, or the last miles of the trip. Well, that's repetitive. You don't need to say the same thing twice. It's wordy. Let's just find an answer choice that cuts out all that extra stuff and just says it right to the point. So F wouldn't be right because it has that redundancy issue. And during those fortunate moments, you don't need to say that. It already says fortunately, right? And then those fortunate moments, you could say it has to do with this, but it more has to do with the fact that it's fortunate. What about so the wind carried them and? Well, the wind carried them is like saying the wind was with them. So you don't need to say both, right? And obviously is the only one that doesn't repeat phrases or words. And if you put it in, fortunately the wind was with them the final few minutes, and they were able to ski up the continent itself. That completely works. It gets rid of that comma, and all you'd have is this word and, where you have a comma and then a new subject, new verb, meaning two independent clauses that it establishes. So grammatically, it makes total sense. So and is the correct answer. Let's go to 13. Which of the following true statements, if added here, would most effectively and specifically emphasize the women's main accomplishment as described in this essay? All right. They were able to ski off the continent itself and onto the Ross ice shelf. So, what emphasized their main accomplishment? It had been a long journey. Well, I guess it does, sure. So it's not completely wrong. It's just very vague. It could be a lot more specific. So let's see if we have something more specific here. They had crossed the Antarctic landmass. That seems to work. You know, Antarctica, everyone knows that's a huge deal. If I wouldn't go there because I would be afraid of freezing. And the fact that they crossed it certainly summarizes what they did. They crossed that whole thing. That was their journey, and it was very arduous, which is sort of an implied thing. You have C, they were relieved to have safely descended Titan Dome. Does this summarize their whole accomplishment? How they how they basically got down the last part of their journey and they were just like, oh, thank God for that. No, this doesn't emphasize that they crossed the whole Antarctic landmass. It just is talking about the last part. So that doesn't summarize or emphasize their main accomplishment. This wasn't their main accomplishment, it was just the end. And what about D? These final miles were some of the speediest of Arneson and Bancroft's trip. Certainly not. It just talks about the last parts, and it just talks about how fast it was, and it doesn't even really mention how for a large part of their trip they had the wind against them, and they were barely going. I think it said like they went 34 miles in 5 days. So it doesn't emphasize at all how difficult a large part of their journey was and how difficult the whole journey was as a whole. So A sort of works, it's just too vague. B is certainly the most specific and gets the point across and emphasizing the main accomplishment. All right, on to question 14. It says the best placement for the underlined word would be, what's the underlined word? Prudently. Okay. So it says, to avoid becoming stranded when winter arrived, the women called the ski plane prudently to airlift them to McMurdo. Well, this wouldn't make sense where it is right now because prudently is an adverb, right? And what it seems to be modifying is ski plane. Ski plane is a noun. Adverbs modify adjectives, verbs, and other adverbs, not nouns. So prudently wouldn't work just based on the specific grammar of it. But in addition to that, prudent is a word that means intelligently or cleverly or with foresight. And can a ski plane do any of those things? A ski plane is just an inert object. Prudent is a word that, or prudently is a word that describes things that people do. It's not things that objects do. And so prudently wouldn't work with ski plane. What about G, before the word becoming? To avoid becoming stranded, to avoid prudently becoming stranded. Well, if they're prudently becoming stranded, it's more like describing the situation of becoming stranded. And certainly becoming stranded, meaning you're left alone in the middle of Antarctica with nothing, that's not a good thing. That's not a prudent thing. Aside from the fact that this isn't a human application to the word prudent. And if you look at H does the same thing, where instead of having prudently here, you have prudently after becoming. It's really just moving it to the next word over, but still within that becoming stranded verb phrase. So H also would not work, but if you have it before the word called, J, it says, to avoid becoming stranded when winter arrived, the women prudently called a ski plane. So that was intelligent of them. They intelligently called. So it's women doing it, people, but not only that, it actually makes sense because they didn't want to get stranded when winter arrived in Antarctica, which would basically make it so freezing, you couldn't, they'd probably freeze to death if it was winter in Antarctica. They're probably doing this trip in the summer, right? They prudently called. That perfectly makes sense with the fact that it was smart of them to do that. Okay, so you would have to have the word prudently before the word called. All right, on to 15. It says, if the writer were to delete the final paragraph of this essay, the essay would primarily lose information that, well, what does the final paragraph say? It's about how they had planned to continue to this next part of McMurdo Station, but they called a ski plane in because, they didn't want to get stranded. It was getting too close to winter. So, what would they lose? Well, what about A? Explains why Arneson and Bancroft were unable to ski to McMurdo Station, their final destination. Sure. It explains why they couldn't get there. They had wanted to go there, but they couldn't because they didn't want to get stranded when winter approached. That's exactly what that final paragraph does. What about B? Explains why skiing to McMurdo Station was part of Arneson and Bancroft's original plan. No, it doesn't say why. It doesn't say, why did we want to go to McMurdo Station? Maybe for this or that reason. No, it doesn't say that. It just says they had wanted to go here, but they couldn't. What about C? Describes the specific weather conditions at different times of the year on the Ross Ice Shelf. Certainly doesn't do that. It certainly doesn't say, well, the weather conditions are like this, and sometimes it's like this, and sometimes the weather's quite nice. Well, no, it doesn't do that at all. What about D? Indicates Arneson and Bancroft's reaction to having to be airlifted to McMurdo Station. No, it doesn't say what the reaction was. Maybe they were relieved. Maybe they were relieved but like disappointed. Oh, we wanted to go there but we couldn't. Well, it doesn't say any of that. It has nothing to do with how they felt about it. So the only answer choice that actually directly summarizes it or directly relates to it is A. Explains why Arneson and Bancroft were unable to ski to McMurdo Station, their final destination. So that's it for passage 1 of test 4. And when you're ready, just move on to the next.